about a New York-based magazine run by a Russian-born poet and translator in a Polish-German bookstore in Berlin. So I think it's a special constellation, and I'm happy about it. I'm sure Lothar will introduce Irina in a moment. I will just say a few words for some of you who don't know about Lothar. He's a German poet and writer living in Berlin, but he's also one of the most important translators of Polish literature into German. He has translated, for example, Henryk Grimberg, one of the most important Polish Jewish still living writers, and also Olga Tokarczuk. His new translation will come out at the end of the year. Tokarczuk got the Booker Prize last year for another English translation. Lothar translates the book into German. And the last thing, but Lothar is also, if, for example, you have some questions on Bruno Schulz, Lothar is an expert on Polish Jewish literature, so you can have a lengthy and interesting discussion about Bruno Schulz with him, definitely. Okay. Thank you for choosing the literature instead of going swimming, for example. Please do ask questions at the end. I'm sure we'll have some question time. I wish you an interesting evening. Mm-hmm.
Good evening to everybody and a very warm welcome, and thank you, Marcin, especially again for this possibility, which is, I would say, a very special occasion, and welcome, Irina. It's very nice that we can be here. I now must think where I start, that I do not just continue one of our conversations during the last days. You are already almost a week here in Berlin. Irina came to literature, one could say, through geography, if you don't mind when I say that. Graduated in geography, and you also dealt with theory of landscape for some time, and I also wanted to ask a question about that. And it was also geography in the time of your university that brought you for some time to Poland. So as we are here in the so-called German-Polish bookstore, we also would like to talk a little bit about some German and Polish aspects. I must apologize a little bit. English is not a language I do use very often, so I will try my best, but in Polish it would be maybe easier, I think, definitely easier. I try my best. Maybe you would like to talk about literature, about poetry, about writing poetry, also about translation, because translation is a very important aspect in your work. And we, of course, will talk about this wonderful journal, Cardinal Points. This is something, actually we met also a little bit through Cardinal Points. And of course, we will hear some of your poems in both languages, in English and in Russian and in English. You have readings in New York, you have readings in London, and you now came to Berlin just from Moscow. Yes. Also from a meeting, from a reading. So these are language and culture spheres that you connect. And lots of your poems also are about these different spheres, how they come together, how they touch each other, how they melt into each other. Also bilingualism is one of your subjects. And you very often work together with the persons that translate your poems. So you cooperate with the translators. Maybe we would start just with a very personal thing. We met 9 years ago, just to give you this background. This was at the Bates College in Lewiston, Maine. There was a poetry festival, and we were invited there, and there we started to talk, and now after 9 years we are here in the Buchbund. In the meantime, we exchanged correspondence, thoughts, books also. and we're waiting for the occasion to meet again. Maybe I could start with this question I brought up before, with these German and Polish aspects. When you, as a student, came to Poland for the first time, because you told me a lot about this stay, and also about the role that Poland played for you in these years.
And before that, my parents were mesmerized by the Polish culture, as actually quite a few people of their circle in Moscow in the 60s and the 70s. Not just literature, and of course films, and of course poetry, and everything Polish was not just cool. It was a window into a different world that was, of course, very evocative and very important to me as already in a young adult, as a student. We were listening to the third program of the Polish radio. Somehow it was not silenced. I have no idea how it happened, but it was the only foreign station that you could actually listen to being in Moscow. And it was mostly rock music and jazz. But actually I love jazz, and I liked Polish jazz as well. So, but those were windows into the world that we were hungry for, and certainly very free. And everything about Poland had this air of freedom loving and bravery and courage against all odds, and that was a charisma, right? But it was certainly more than just a charisma. It was very substantial. The Polish poetry that I then read in Russian. Now I no longer read translations into Russian for some reason. If I happen to read something that I cannot read the original of, I normally turn to English translations for some reason. This gives you another layer that makes it a little bit more real. I don't know how to explain it, but reading Russian translations, it doesn't give you this feeling of genuine of genuine reading, of the authentic. I don't know, it's probably just me, but then I was reading Norvid in Russian translation, for example, right, and Zagayevsky in Russian translations, and certainly Mickiewicz.
And during that stay, you did some work also. Did I understand that right? During that stay in Poland.
In Poland, we were students of paleogeography department, so we were digging all the time. Where we're going around Poland. And digging those layers, making sketches of the layers of the Pleistocene era. But certainly it was more than that. It was a cultural acquaintance, and it was for 3 weeks. So our professors made sure we see something else, and drink this honey-based. What is that alcohol, honey-based thing, which is in Ukrainian it's called midavucha. Krakow, yeah, it was quite an experience too. So it was very rounded. Yeah.
Miód pitny.
Probably, yeah. Probably. It was strong.
Yeah, and to come to these German aspects. Now you came from Moscow to Berlin, but you have still 2 other cities ahead to visit. And as we were talking during the last days, I had in my mind after our conversation really something like a map, which is a map of Russian literature projected on German cities. I found this quite interesting. So we were also walking through Berlin, looking for some places. And maybe you could say something about these points, because you choose also special places and wanted to know them because of this map of Russian literature.
Yes, well, you could call it an obsession, of course, of a person who has to do with literature. And so you're looking for someone who also created in words, right? And is important to you since one's youth. Nabokov, for one, and Tsvetaeva. So all those very important authors and souls, you would say, to us, who landed here in the early 20s. And some of them left very quickly, like Marina Tsvetaeva, who only stayed here for less than 80 days, and then she went to Prague with her husband. But Nabokov, as you know, lived here for 15 years, between 1922 and 1937, when he moved to Paris. So I obsessively was looking for the places that had to do with them, obsessively, but with some kind of fear, because I realized that you cannot really touch and really feel those buildings, those little squares, because the way they see them, the way they did, not because obviously the city has changed, but dramatically, but because you cannot really feel what they felt, even remotely, if you come with a visa, with normal, regular papers, your papers in order, you have currency, you're free, right? You're free to leave, you're free to stay, and to understand what these people who were stateless, as you know, that was their official status, they were stateless, the so-called Nansen passport. They didn't belong to any state in the world, so to connect with their experience, I found that it was actually impossible. But I still was looking and found a tennis court the other day where Nabokov gave lessons, tennis lessons, was a coach, and some other corners of the Russian Berlin. And in Köln, in Cologne, I will be meeting with colleagues, contemporary Russian writers and poets, friends, but before that I'll go to Marburg, where Pasternak was a student, and Heidelberg, where Mandelstam was a student. So you see, it's very skewed leans towards the Russian literature.
And when we met in 2010, Cardinal Points was quite young. Is that right?
It was just born.
It was just born. Yeah, it was the first issue. Is that right?
It was the first issue of the Cardinal Points, which is the English language journal. At the time, maybe I just saw that you had the third, and the reason I wanted to show this is because you see the number 12. We thought that the 12th issue of our, and this is the first one. So this is 12.3, that's 12 volume 1. We thought it will be the 12th issue of our older journal, Storony Sveta, which is exactly what Cardinal Points means in Russian. And that had been published for 5 years already. Before that, it started in 2005. But then we realized that we'll have one issue in English, and it's just acquired a life of its own. So we met when it started acquiring a life of its own.
Mm-hmm. And could you please say something about the concept? The concept, I guess, was connected to some feeling maybe of a need, or something that you would say was missing, something that you wanted to present, and also because Cardinal Points contains lots of translations, and just maybe some words about the concept, and also about the choice, the discussion, which made Cardinal Points come into life.
Yeah, Cardinal Points is a strange journal. It's easy to say what it is not. It is not an academic journal. It is not a journal of translation, so it's not an modern poetry and translation, another version of it. It's actually literary art, as we call it, a literary and art journal of literature and art, but of course it has certain it's particular in some way. First of all, it's dedicated to de-Stalinization of the air. And when we came up, actually, I was the culprit. I was the one who came up with this idea, and people and my co-editor and editor-in-chief of the entire, the founder of the entire project, the late Oleg Wolf, he immediately agreed that this would be a good slogan, but our friends did not, because in 2010, de-Stalinization, come on, it's 2010. And now it's 2019, and here you go. Nobody is asking why. It's not that we felt something and not that we were prophets, but there is something that always exists, unfortunately, and that one has to fight against. And one of such things is oblivion, because many of the authors who are great writers, the best writers, pretty much, who wrote in the Russian language in the 20th century, like Andrei Platonov, Vasily Grossman, who's different in a different way, an amazing writer, Shalamov. Many of them are just myths. Their names are mythological, but people don't really know their texts. And what was important to us, and now we're coming to the point where what it is, right? We want to present good, very good, some of them are new, some of them are not new, but most of them are new translations, the texts of these terrific writers. Not Tsvetaeva, this mythological poetess who is very often confused with Akhmatova, right? Mm-hmm. But her texts. And when it comes to translation, what was very important to us in the Russian journal, and it was certainly very important here, is this section, the art of translation, that is has to do with translators' experiences translating the work. So it's their intimate connection with the text and with the author behind the text. And it's very intimate, it's not academic. It's, I would say, confessional very often. It's very, very intimate. For example, Stanley Mitchell's translation of Eugene Onegin, which is, I think, to me, it's the best translation that exists so far. He did it for 20 years, and he had bipolar disorder, and he is frankly describing it, how he almost destroyed it several times, and how he worked on it in the hospital. So you create this connection with the text you translate, and then we ask people to write about it. So we sort of, I wouldn't say commissioned, but we asked for it. And I know that you translated your many of your books for a long, long time. So when you translate, for example, Gogol, Donald Rayfield is writing how he translated Gogol for a year. And then at the end of the year, there is this creature that is not Gogol and not Rayfield, and there is this bond that a translator acquires with the book and with the shadow behind the book.
And you also published in Cardinal Points new translations from, I remember, for example, Shalamov. There was one issue with, it was the resurrection of the lark, I think.
Yes.
Which was completely new, is that right?
Many of them
that is texts that exist in English, but you decided that you want to make a new translation, and there was also a text about the work on this the translation of this story. What is the process then that you how do you come to to the collaboration with the translators?
Well, sometimes we know that, especially, there are 3 co-editors, I have to say it. We haven't even mentioned them yet. I'm just one of the co-editors. When it comes to this specific journal, Robert Chandler and Boris Draluk, who's now managing editor of Cardinal Points, my wonderful collaborators and co-editors. Robert Chandler suggested he knew of this work by Anna Gunin, who was working on Shalamov, and he invited her with this text. And then very often we publish them, and then these texts become books, very well received. For example, Peter Daniels' translation from Hadasevich. You probably know this wonderful poet who lived in Paris before the war. And we were the first, we actually helped even Peter to connect with a Russian-speaking person who would help him with translation, with the original. And then his book is now a bestseller. It's a little bit of bragging, but it's just we are trying to invite and embrace.
And the meeting you had now in Moscow, can you tell something about this? Because this is also connected to the journal, but it shows somehow the other sphere of this whole idea and this whole project.
Yes. This older sibling of this journal, Storony Sveta, I published the 18th volume and decided that would be the last issue, and we finished. We ended the Russian journal, and now there is no confusion. Nobody will be asking which one is that. So it was a bittersweet farewell to the Russian journal, Storony Sveta. It was the launch of this last issue, and saying goodbye to this whole project that lasted for 13 years, which is not. It's not such a short time for a journal, especially in it's not an émigré journal, but it's a journal that is published by a private person, me. Now we started together with Oleg Wolf, and in 2011 it was just me. So 13 years, it's a lot. And I just recently learned that in Greek, newspapers, you know what newspapers are called? This Greek name is ephemerides. Ephemerides, so which is really cool. And many journals are ephemerides because it's especially the ones that they are born and then they disappear. But some of them they sort of disappear, but then they stay, because I don't think it's a farewell. Everyone was so. I tried to make it cheerful, but people were so sad. It was almost like a funeral. But I tried to convince them that it's this. Boris Draluk said a wonderful thing. He said that these old journals, they're like caves through which you come into connection with the familiar spirits. So they go away, the journals of the 30th, of the 20th, but we still now they're archives, and you go to connect with the names and the authors and their texts that are important to you. So they're here. They're here to stay.
And could you say also some words about the concept of the Russian, the journal in Russian, which was the first one, and what was your aim when this was founded?
Well, Oleg Wolf came up with the idea, and it was just a good. He wanted to create a good Russian journal, literary journal that would be democratic, that would correspond with the authors, that would reply to people who write to it, that would choose names, the text not by names but by the quality, And certainly we had some our personal idiosyncratic, we lean towards certain traditions and certain qualities of the text, but it was there was no, it wasn't about certain schools or trends in literature. It was something deeper than that helped us choose what we chose. But I don't think we had a manifesto. We started without a manifesto. We just started a journal at the time that there were not that many good journals, in our opinion. Now there are many Russian language journals that are really terrific. And there was one thing that was important to me personally. The whole craft of creating a journal is a very interesting thing. That's why it took so many years to end it, because it's very interesting to make a journal as a fugue, as an intertwining themes that are not explicitly named. Of course, it's not in the thematic journal, but dedicated to this or that theme or topic, God forbid. But it's just like a big poem, where you hear some themes, like in a fugue, you would, right? Mm-hmm. And new meanings are created through the very existence of that book, this new book, which is a journal. And the new meanings had not existed before it was published, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. It's just like with any poem, right? With any good, real poem, right? It brings into the world something that had not existed before it was created. So something like this.
And I wanted to ask about the public of the Russian journal, the recipients of this journal. Could you say something about this?
The readers?
Yes.
The readers were everywhere. We no longer needed to say that it's an international journal because of the internet. And the first 6 issues were online, actually. And then we actually were asked to create it on paper as well. And it so happened that it was both online and on paper, and but it was read everywhere where the internet exists. So people who happen to like literature, I would say. They don't belong to any particular class or class, I would say, using a Vonnegut term.
There is another huge project which was published recently. It is this Penguin book of Russian poetry, quite a volume. You can also have a look at it afterwards. And this was, can I say, one of the biggest projects of the last year to prepare this, because I remember that the idea of this anthology showed up in some of your mails quite some years ago, and then from time to time you wrote me about the progress and about the work. Maybe you could say something about the beginning and the idea, and also about the work on it, because you had a very special idea to make this anthology.
But yeah, I was just a co-editor. The person who was at the helm of this project was Robert Chandler, who kindly invited me to be his collaborator when he started. I think it was 2011, and it took us more than 4 years. And in the process, very soon, Boris Gerlych joined us. We invited him to join us. So it's certainly a labor of love, and 600 pages, thousands of emails every day. Some of the translations are new. Some of them were commissioned. A lot of translations done by Robert and Boris. Beautiful short notes written by them. There are a few of mine, but I would say, the Russian ear mostly. My contribution was to participate in the process of translation rather than being an author of any particular translation. And there are some of the translations we didn't even know the authors. We couldn't find any information about some translations that were superb, but we knew nothing and we could find nothing about them. There are a few of those. And the interesting thing about this book is that the previous Penguin anthology was done it was bilingual in the 70s, came out in the 70s, and it was not poetic translations. It was done as a pretty much verbatim, word-for-word translation, just to give the semantics, to give the idea of the semantics. And this is, of course, an absolutely different paradigm, and it was Robert Chandler's principle, and we shared it, that if a poem is very important, if the poet is very important, and there is a particular poem that is very important, but it just doesn't have a translation that would do justice, we would not include it. So that's why it's somewhat skewed. There are poets who are presented with more text than others. It doesn't mean that they're more important. It's just because we couldn't find the translations that we could be comfortable including, because they would not do justice to the poet and to the poem and to the diction, and would not give the they would not show what actually made those poems great, like Tuchev, for example.
Mm-hmm. Now we can talk about the translating work on your own poems. I find this very interesting, for example, that some of your poems do exist in both, in two versions, in Russian and in English, and some of your poems only exist in English. Is there something that you know already when you start writing, when it all comes to the first beginnings, or is it not somehow predictable if it starts in Russian and then there will be a translation, or if it starts immediately in English?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I have an answer to it. Well, but writing in Russian is, of course, I'm a Russian poet who happens to be the author of a certain number of English language texts. But of course, I don't think of myself as an English language author, because I'm not one. I started writing poems when I was, say, 4 or 5, right, in Russian. And my first self-translations happened when I was 37 or so, right? So it's a very different life. And why I had to self-translate, it was a very practical reason. Well, there were a few, I toyed with a couple of poems before that, but when I was studying at a master's program, I enrolled into a master's program, Master of Fine Arts in Poetics. It was just an assignment I had to do, come up every month. It was mandatory. And I would choose, I actually wrote a piece on translation recently for this very good online journal, actually portal called that through, about this process of self-translation. I chose Russian poems that were not good enough, something that I would not spare, and because first of all, I thought that the ones that I really felt that were well, good enough not to be translated. They weren't translatable. The things that I liked about them were untranslatable, precisely. So I chose what I thought the worst, the least important poems to me. But then, in the process, it became actually interesting. The very impossibility of it was very alluring, and so it just started getting more and more interesting. And then poems started to appear that didn't have a Russian original. And the question you asked is a very good question, but I don't think I can answer that. Yes, it's probably subconsciously, you subconsciously choose the language, and probably it can be analyzed, but I never analyzed why certain poems appear originally in this or that language. There must be a reason, but I don't know. Yeah.
Would you say that sometimes there are two originals, or would you say that the translation is always a translation? Because I think it quite often, if someone is living in two languages, it occurs that actually he or she would not call a translation a real translation, but a second original.
If one is alive and is participating or is self-translating.
Yes.
Yes, of course, the author can take liberties. The author knows what is essential, what is the pillar of the poem, and what can be sacrificed, what can be altered. And the author, him or herself, is very free in that sense, much freer than the translator, who has this constraints and has this feels that he or she should be faithful to certain things that are important. But the author is much freer. You can toss certain things and bring in some other meanings even, because they're much more alive in this new target language. But even going backwards, I would say that any poem read by a reader in one language is already a translation, because each reader is a translator, right? There is this, it's like two elementary particles in two different universes. They know and they react to each other. So do the author or the text rather and the reader, right? They alter each other in a way. So you can actually make another step and take another step and go backwards. So every original is already a translation of something, of a conception in a way, right? By the author. So you can go backwards endlessly until you die or stop working, and then everything freezes.
But this also, I think, you also need a person as a translator, especially when you work together on such translations. A person who is ready to cooperate, and I think this is a very special relationship, because it needs, on the one hand, as you said, some the possibility of altering things, but on the other hand, you somehow must speak the same language, not in means of first language or foreign language, but the same language concerning poetry and the imagination of poetry. So, and as I know from your translations into English, that they are marked like translated by Boris Dralyuk with the author. So you work together now for some time already, and
since 2011. Yes, and it has to be a very keen soul. It has to be someone who has the same or similar sensibilities when it comes to poetry. And I'm absolutely, I'm so fortunate, I'm blessed knowing Boris Dralyuk, who is a brilliant translator and a very keen soul. and Maria Blastein, a translator from Canada, who is also a brilliant translator and has this connection with my text. Sometimes I think they're deeper than my own connections with my own texts. And working together is so interesting. So normally it starts with their first draft, and then we start working and back and forth, and finally come up with something that is that poem, but it's also already a different creature, different original, if you will.
Maybe we could hear now some of your poems also in Russian, in the Russian language, and in the translation.
Shall we start with Chuklinski, no?
Yeah, we could start with this. Yeah, but I think it would be good if you give maybe a little introduction to this.
To Pan Chuklinski.
Yes, to this poem.
Well, this poem is dedicated to Oleg Wolf, and who had Polish ancestry. But the theme, underlying theme, you can easily hear through all the historic references, is this going back and forth between the Polish spirit that comes up in the end of the poem and the Byzantine, you would say, tradition, which is a little bit more, well, you will hear what it is about. And Lothar translated it into German, and Tony Brinkler and I translated it into English, so now this poem exists in 3 languages. Oleg's name, family name was Chuklinski. His grandfather's name was Chuklinski, and it seems like, although it's very hard to tell now because it had to be hidden during the Soviet regime, but it came from some Schlachta. There is such a word, yes, right. And some small nobility. And this Oleg was a very honorable and very brave and very free-spirited person. And it seems it's somehow connected in my mind with this tradition. Also, there is a reference to the Lermontov's poem about the song at the end, about the stars. That's a famous poem that every Russian person knows, about the Milky Way as a silicon way. So, which version will we start with?
The Russian, maybe.
Russian? Or maybe German, so that everybody understands English. Russian? Okay. На ладье за налогами князь отправляется медом мехами. Только вскроется Волхов, теряет покровы земля, заголяясь болотами, мхами. Ух, налегшие на свежие весла терзают уключены други, а на правом крутом вон глядит, заметались костры, как вернулись из греков варяги. А на пойменном левом отлогом, как ветром сгибаемый данью, к нему двинут тростник и осока, и зато на зрачок не поспеет за весельной тенью. У Добрыни лицо, как вода, а зрачки штукаряги в затоне, где по зарослям первенцев прячут. А что так не дадут, он легко, улыбаясь, отымет. Только что мне скажи эти витязи, что угрюмая летопись та мне, где не грозный, так вешатель, а блаженный, так весел и прям, за лесами, за чудо-кустами. На зачатье висели над полем небесные серые камни, кругом грубым таким, что вовек никуда мне от них. Но ты, пане, не помни. По кремнистым ручьям на кремнистый выходишь на шлях ты, и ни лисьих сокровищ, ни византийской смолы, крупной солью рассеянной шляхты. We probably need to also to explain the names of the czars, right?
Mm-hmm.
The names of the czars, a hangman. Can you say a few words about that?
No.
Yes. There is you'll hear the nicknames of Russian czars, and when I'm saying that, whoever you take, it's either a hangman or the terrible. But if there is a kind of a madman, then that person is actually light and cheerful and direct. So I'm playing a little bit with the nicknames of the czars.
Now the English.
Oh, no, the English. Oops.
I have it here.
You have it here?
Yes,
oh, wonderful. Okay, great. When ice melts on the Volkhov, and Volkhov is a river in the north. When ice melts on the Volkhov, and ground sheds its shroud, bed, naked, swan and moss, the prince embarks on the river, collecting honey, fur, and taxes. His oarsmen stretch their oars, torture the oarlocks. From the right bank, fire lash, the Varyags have returned from the Greeks. From the left, gentle shore, bowed, as if by wind, to render tribute. Trasnik, the red grass, and Asoka, the sedge grass, set sail to meet him, as the still water's eye fall back from the oar's shadow. Dobrynya, the kind's face is like water, his eyes like a sawyer's in the backwaters where they hide the firstborn in bushes. Whatever is not given freely, the smiling night plunders. But tell me, what are these heroes to me? All these dark chronicles. If it's not the terrible, then it's the hangman. And God's fool is fair and direct, in the land lurking in fairy tale bushes. When I was conceived, gray celestial rocks in a tight circle hovered above the field. I am still in it, but you, Pan Chuklinski, are free. On milky streams, along the sky's flint tracks you come, with no cunning treasures, fox's fur, no Byzantine resins, only the coarse, hard-grained salt of your scattered nobility. It was translated by Tony Brinkley and myself.
Yeah, I was absolutely overwhelmed by this poem when you sent me the English version. It just took me away, really, because of this rhythm and this energy which is in these verses. And I must admit that this is still a sketch. I do not consider this to be finished, but it was just it was very tempting to try it. And you remember, as we were corresponding also about some questions. So this is obviously not something to be published. It is for today's evening, actually. And I think I will work on it further, and I hope also for your advice and assistance to bring it to a good end. Pan Chuklinski. Wenn das Eis bricht auf dem Volkhov, die Erde abstreift ihr Leichentuch, blach wird und nackt, Sumpfland und Moos, besteigt der Fürst sein Boot. Um Honig geht die Reise, Felle und Steuertribut. Hart führen seine Ruderer die Riemen, schinden die Dollen, vom rechten Ufer blakt Feuerschein, die Varäger sind zurückgekehrt aus Griechenland. Am linken, dem sanften Gestade, neigt sich, als wehte ein Wind in Ehrfurcht, Trastnik setzt ihre Segel zum Gruß, die Asoka, Segge und Ried, wenn die Blicke der Tümpel versinken unter den Schatten der Riemen. Dobryna, sein gütiges Antlitz, ein sanfter Spiegel, bergend die Augen der tückischen Strünke, wenn hastig im Schilf sie verstecken die Erstgeburt, was immer es sei, der Recke raubt es mit einem Lächeln. Sag mir, was sind diese Helden für mich? Chroniken der Finsternis, hier waltet ein Schrecklicher, dort wütet ein Henker, und Gottes Narr, gerecht und mehr, lauert im Buschwerk der Märchen. Als ich gezeugt wurde, schwebte ein Bannkreis himmlischer Felsen über dem Feld, noch immer umschließt mich der graue Zirkel, doch du, Piekoszewski, bist frei. Auf milchigen Strömen, die glimmende Feuersteinfährte des Firmaments entlang, kommst du gezogen und nichts führst du mit, an verschlagenen Schätzen, Fuchsfellen, Harz aus Byzanz, nur das scharfe, hartkörnige Salz deines zerspellten Adels.